The sea of faith was once to, at the full and round earth's shore, lay like the folds of a bright girdle furled, but now I only hear its melancholy, long withdrawing roar. And that long withdrawing roar of the sea of faith has, in a way, stood as a place marker for the retreat of religion, over the last 150 years or more since he wrote those words. And it was almost blindingly obvious when I thought about it, but I hadn't really thought, but yeah, Matthew Arnold's Sea of Faith could come in again. We could maybe even be seeing that turning of the tide in our generation, because I'd noticed similar things, the sort of, as we said, new atheism sort of growing old, and the fact that increasingly I was seeing interesting secular intellectuals taking Christianity seriously again, not necessarily believing themselves, but certainly giving it the time of day, not dismissing it, and even opening the door to it, perhaps for other people.
Welcome to another episode of Re-Enchanting, the podcast from Seen and Unseen, where we speak to interesting people about the Christian story that has shaped our world, and we wonder whether, being as postmodern and as post-Christian as it is, it might be re-enchanted by the mystery of it once more. I am Belle Tindall, and sitting directly next to me is not Justin Brierley.
I am not Justin Brierley.
You are not Justin Brierley.
Definitely
Who
not.
are you?
I am Graham Tomlin. So I've done many podcasts in the past and been a guest on this one, but
Yes.
This is my first time as a presenter alongside you, Belle.
Yeah.
But I'm not Justin Brierley today.
No, not quite. But have no fear, Justin Brierley is here. And in fact, for one episode and one episode only, he's in the hot seat.
Well, I figured, I might as well use my power as a presenter to take advantage at least one episode of Re-Enchanting.
Exactly. So we've done a swap.
Side. Yes.
So I've sat in that seat. You've sat in this one many times.
I'll see what it's like to get a taste of my own medicine.
Yeah.
Grilled by those of us on this side of the table.
We'll be very kind. We'll be as kind as you always are, I promise.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Speak for yourself here, Belle.
Yeah, sorry, I will be.
Exactly, yeah. I know.
Of course, to listeners of Re-Enchanting, Justin, you need no introduction, but you deserve one. So aside from being the co-host of Re-Enchanting, you are an all-round broadcasting legend. And I swear Justin did not write this. These are my words. Having hosted many of the most captivating faith conversations of the last 15 years, Justin is a speaker and an author with two brilliant books under his belt. The first one, Unbelievable, Why After 10 Years of Talking with Atheists, I'm Still a Christian. And the brand new book, which we're going to be talking a whole lot about today, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, Why New Atheism Grew Old and Secular Thinkers Are Considering Christianity Again. So we're going to be chatting to Justin all about the new book, everything else you're up to, because it's a whole lot.
With an intro like that, I just feel like I should pull you on board as my PR person or something, Belle.
That's absolutely fine.
That was tremendous.
Oh, I'll make it my side hustle. No problem at all.
And you're doing a lot of social media stuff at the moment as well?
Yes. Getting out there a little bit on social media. I just recently, at the time of recording at least, published a video that got a lot of response on Twitter. It was a slightly kind of one of those sort of sketches, and I was playing both the Christian and atheist, and not a lot of atheists approved, put it that way. But it was all meant in good humour, I hope. But anyway, yes.
Provoked discussion, which is a good thing.
I try.
Wonderful. Good. So we're going to be chatting about all things atheism, faith, theology, culture. But before we delve into any of that, I would be remiss to not turn our signature library-inspired question onto you and ask you what you are reading at the moment.
I've been waiting for months to be able to answer this question myself.
I hope it just the timing worked out and you've got a really good answer.
No, I am reading a couple of great books at the moment, actually. One of them, the non-fiction book, is by Andrew Clavin, and it's called I think it's called The Truth and the Beauty, and he's got an interesting story himself. He's a sort of American convert to Christianity from secular Judaism, and he's had a very successful career as a crime sort of novelist and screenwriter, but he had this adult conversion sort of, I think, in his 40s or 50s, and he's written this book. This most recent book is sort of looking at the way that the romantic poets, Wordsworth and so on, embodied essentially the Christian faith in their poetry, and then sort of pointing that back to Jesus and the Sermon on the Mount and all sorts of things. So it's a really interesting book, and I'm learning a lot about the Romantics that I never knew, because I'm not nearly as well read as you are, Belle, in these things. But as I say every week, but the other book is just an old classic. It's The Lord of the Rings. I'm kind of going through
classic.
J.R.R. Tolkien's famous book. Though having said that, I haven't read it since probably 20 years ago was the last time I went through it properly.
How far are you into it now?
I'm about a third of the way in. So sort of through the first.
Have you been watching the new video version?
Well, I've heard mixed reviews. I watched the first few episodes, and to be honest, it wasn't grabbing me that much. And then all the purists started saying, "This is terrible. Tolkien would have been rolling in his grave." I don't get involved in those debates, but I like the book, so
Very good.
Nothing ever compares to the book ever. We should stop expecting it to, I think, and then we'll all be happy.
The problem is, you see, we were sort of doing a sort of bit of going through Harry Potter in the summer holidays with the kids, some audiobook while we were traveling. And the problem is that I do have all the characters from the films in my head now whenever I think of them. So it does make a difference eventually to how you start thinking about these things.
I rode my bike past Tolkien's old house in Oxford the other day, because we live in Oxford, and his house is just about half a mile down the road from ours. And it's just kind of a very ordinary kind of pebble dash house on a sort of back street. And you kind of think, this is very strange. This whole new world was created out of just a very ordinary place maybe Oxford isn't a very ordinary place, but it just felt very kind of down to earth. Well, and you get the work of the imagination coming out of something genuinely
mythology almost grows
real
around the people who created these stories, don't they? And people sort of imagine that they're these towering intellects with these sublime personal lives. In fact, they're quite ordinary a lot of the time.
He was
just they had extraordinary ideas.
Wandering around in his tweed jacket down to lecture in the university, and wandering home again for tea with his wife, I suppose. So,
You're bursting a lot of bubbles right now, you two.
Sorry,
I like to picture that he lives in a house with a round door and a grass roof.
Doesn't have a round door. I can guarantee that. It's got a round plaque on the front.
Oh, that'll do.
Well, yeah, that's good.
There you go.
Yeah, good. So we wanted to ask you one or two things about really how you got into this in the first place, Justin, because I guess a lot of people will have they'll have listened to you on Unbelievable. They'll maybe have followed many of the conversations that are referred to in the book that you've had. And you've got a real gift of being able to facilitate good conversations between people who come at things with very different angles, for atheists, people of faith, and so on. And I guess what intrigues me is what got you into that in the first place? What interested you in that particular mode of communication, that role of being a sort of mediator between different people and so on? What led to the getting into the conversations in the first place?
Well, I'd sort of begun working in broadcasting and sort of cut my teeth in radio journalism and hosting and that kind of thing. And I was working and, had spent most of my adult working life working for a Christian radio station in London, Premier Christian Radio. And at that point, they were doing a great job of creating Christian sort of programming for Christians to kind of resource them. But there was nothing really on there that demonstrated what it would look like to engage with a non-Christian. And so that was really the purpose of the show. I just felt like actually that's probably where most people spend a lot of their time, actually. You don't have the luxury of living in a Christian bubble as you do perhaps in some parts of the USA or wherever in the UK. So that was the idea, was really kind of could we create a show where we could bring people into conversation. And yeah, in a sense, I wanted to have an evangelistic edge, at least in helping people to sort of think about how they would answer objections to faith and share that. What I didn't anticipate, I suppose, was that when it became a podcast, this sort of show that brought Christians and non-Christians together, that a lot of non-Christians would also start listening. And that was the unique thing about the show eventually, that it actually ended up having quite a diverse audience of both Christians and atheists, agnostics, and people of other worldviews, because both sides were being brought on. And so that it kind of evolved almost, without me having any clear idea at the beginning of what it would become. And it was just an absolute privilege. I only recently stepped back from hosting the show, but it was a wonderful sort of 17 and a half years of hosting these conversations.
Yeah. And even before that, did you have a background in reading, studying theology or the Bible?
No,
or any of that
no, honestly not. I mean, I sort of walked into radio more or less straight out of university or after a brief gap year after my wife and I got married. And so in that sense, I was very new to everything. I'd read politics, philosophy, and economics, but not theology. I effectively did theology by proxy doing this show, sort of thing, and coming to grips with all the different forms of theology that exist out there, because it was just as much Christians coming together for dialogue as it was.
And did your faith begin through encountering this kind of material itself, or was it a different route into Christian faith for you?
No, for me, probably the first sort of real moment was quite an experiential one. I come from sort of quite a charismatic evangelical church background originally, and that was the way in which I kind of stepped into faith. But I think it was pretty soon after that, as I went to university especially, that I started to be challenged by the questions that people naturally ask. And that was when I started to dig into, C.S. Lewis and people like that.
Yeah. I'll ask you a little bit more about the experiential side in a moment. But I guess another question leading on from what we were talking about is that, I mean, you've had a lot of different conversations, and a lot of them are referred to in the book. And I think at one point in the book, you refer to your favorite one, which was a debate between Tom Holland and A.C. Grayling.
Yes.
And
one of my favorites. I mean, it is a bit like asking me to choose between my children, the favorite debate. But they're also different.
I remember listening to that one. I was going on a walk, quite near our house. I think it was during COVID, I think it was. And I remember listening to it, and it got quite feisty. It got quite sort of, and I remember Tom Holland getting really quite sort of energized by it. And Grayling, it was quite real cut and thrust. I mean, what was it about that conversation that made it one of the best ones for you?
I mean, partly it was because it was a little bit different, I suppose, because actually you couldn't necessarily put Tom Holland in the Christian box, whereas normally there was a Christian, non-Christian kind of dynamic going on. These were simply two academics really having a discussion in quite objective terms
about history,
about
how you interpret it.
And how you interpret it exactly. Tom Holland had just published, the book that has been referred to many times on this show, Dominion, all about the way in which the Christian Revolution really shaped the moral instincts of the West.
You should stop paying us.
We could be the PR people for Tom, couldn't we?
Yeah.
Anyway, and it happened that A.C. Grayling, well-known atheist philosopher, had also published something of a magnum opus of his own, a sort of history of philosophy. And I just noticed when I started reading A.C. Grayling's book that in the very first pages, he basically, tore a new one off Christianity. He basically said, this was a terrible blight on the progress of philosophy, because all of those early Christians rampaged through Alexandria and destroyed the library. And, how much more wonderful material will we have from the ancient Greeks if they hadn't done that? Anyway, I sort of sent that to Tom Holland and said, what do you think of this, Tom? And he wrote back an email that I won't repeat the words of. But basically, I thought, well, this could be fun if we got them together. And miraculously, A.C. Grayling said yes as well. So it was fun. It was a kind of guilty pleasure, if I'm honest, because the first 20 or 30 minutes of that conversation are just sort of, they're just gold in terms of this back and forth between Tom Holland getting increasingly annoyed with A.C. Grayling and his take on history. So, but it was ultimately a great conversation, and that's the best kind. That's why I enjoyed it so much.
You're very good at staying neutral, but there was delight in your eyes in that conversation, I think, even though no one could ever accuse you of having partiality.
Well, when I mean, I'm always up for the kind of calm, rational, fruitful debates. But there's nothing wrong with a bit of drama as well. And that was definitely one of the ones where it got sparky. And I was just thinking, oh, that'll be great for YouTube. That moment. I mean, I hate to say it, but it was like, oh, they're going to love this.
This is going to
work. So it was. And it became a very, very popular sort of video and podcast. So, yeah.
In an earlier episode of this podcast, we had the wonderful Frank Skinner on, and he said, we asked him about David Baddiel's book, and he said, no, I haven't read it, I'm not going to. And then he said, I'm not interested in talking to atheists. I've realised that people with and without faith speak inherently different languages. What's the point? I'm assuming you don't agree with that.
I see where he's coming from, because yes, there are going to be kind of, sometimes it feels like we're passing like ships in the night because we are speaking different languages. We're just coming from such different worldviews. It's hard to make them sort of meet in a sense. I would say, though, that most people I meet are usually a bit of a mixture of head and heart. And to that extent, there are going to be people for whom their journey to faith is going to involve intellectual questions. And there's no harm in having those kinds of discussions and debates even that may help to, provide some answers, take them down that road. So I know plenty of people for whom that has been a significant factor in their journey towards faith. I agree, though. Other times it can feel like you're beating a dead horse if you're just trying to persuade someone through purely intellectual arguments and that kind of thing.
Sure.
It can feel like you're talking a different language. And I think you just need to know when is the right time to be using that kind of approach and when not. And but by and large, I don't know. I feel like as the new atheism sort of era has passed a little bit, there's been a bit more of an opening up towards the idea of different ways of knowing things other than a purely kind of scientific materialist approach to things. So I think that even the quality of the conversations has got a bit better sometimes than maybe it was 10, 15 years ago.
Well, have you drawn any conclusions on? I mean, you talk to a lot of people who have a Christian faith, those who don't, who are atheists or agnostics or whatever. And I guess one of those intriguing questions as to what makes someone a Christian or not, what makes you believe or not believe. And what, one answer would be, well, it's all about rationality and logic. And, sometimes the sort of rationalist atheists will say, well, those who really think hard about it will end up being atheists. And, if people with faith or people who haven't really thought about it very deeply, I guess we would probably just disagree with that analysis. But I guess that question of what is it that makes someone a Christian or a believer or an unbeliever? I mean, you were talking about how you came to faith through a more experiential route. And I mean, someone like Michael Buckley, who the philosopher who wrote a book, The Origins of Modern Atheism, one of the great sort of analyses of where atheism came from historically, kind of argues much the same, really. At the end of the day, it's primarily religious experience that brings people to faith rather than argumentation. But have you discerned any patterns as to what makes people believe or not believe?
I think there is almost always a sort of experiential element to it. I couldn't say always whether that precedes or comes after a sort of an intellectual journey. Now, for me, the intellectual journey did sort of come after, but I might not have been able to stay a Christian if I hadn't had the intellectual journey, in a sense, because that made sense of a much bigger set of kind of issues for me than just this one moment, that I had in my late teens. For other people, I've certainly seen the intellectual journey precede some kind of defining spiritual experience that they seemed to need to kind of make that final step. So I can think of a friend of mine, Guillaume Bignon, who's a French former atheist who sort of was determined to prove his at the time American Christian girlfriend wrong about religion. Ended up having a lot of conversations with a pastor about this and went on this big intellectual journey. But it was a kind of specific moment where he kind of got basically convicted of what his things that were wrong in his life. That kind of was the thing that pushed him across the edge, if you like. So I quite often feel like it's happening at that level in that sense, and it's very rarely just one or the other in most people's lives. Yeah,
which is not surprising when you think actually the heart of Christian faith is not primarily an intellectual construct, but it is an encounter with God. It's more than just you have to sort of think about that and analyze it and make sense of it. But at its heart, it is an encounter with a person.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
Therefore, it's not surprising that there's always going to be that experiential element to it rather than purely being
and in the area
game.
Where I've sort of worked most of my life, apologetics, so defense of the Christian faith. One thing I have come to appreciate, I think, is that often when it's best employed as a sort of way of helping people to approach Christian faith, it's more for removing barriers, but the person still has to want what's on offer at the end of the road. You can't force someone to walk down that road if they don't want what's on offer at the end. So there's that sort of sense of the personal element has to come into it. It's not purely objective facts and logic.
Yeah. And Justin, I think your first book was called Why After 10 Years of
Talking with Atheists, I'm Still a Christian.
Yeah. As you look back on those conversations, the conversations in the new book, was there ever one of those conversations that made you think, maybe they've got a point here?
Oh, yeah.
Shook your faith
Plenty.
in some way?
I mean, I still encounter
wonder.
people who sort of give me pause for thought. It's not like I've got this all worked out by any stretch. I guess, one example that comes to mind from several years ago was Bart Ehrman, well-known New Testament Bible critic, who sort of himself sort of lost his faith for various reasons. But he wrote a best-selling sort of popular level book called Misquoting Jesus, essentially questioning the veracity of the New Testament documents and whether they've been reliably transmitted over the years and so on. And when I read that book, I was quite shaken. I think this was very early on, really, in me really understanding how the Bible came together. And that was, I definitely sort of gave me pause for thought. But then I brought on a great scholar opposite him, Peter J. Williams from Tyndale House in Cambridge, and they had a brilliant back and forth. And I always tend to find there's always a counter argument. There's always something on the other side. And what does happen is that usually your probably fairly naive notions of some concepts have to be, deconstructed a bit. But usually I found a way of reconstructing them and actually coming out with something more nuanced, deeper, stronger in the end.
Talking about your new book, which we very handily have in front of us, very aesthetically pleasing new book,
very
by
good.
the way.
Wow, thank you very much.
Yep.
The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. You start it by just outlining new atheism, and just for anyone who's been living under a rock, or for anyone who, I realised that new atheism peaked when I was still watching like CBBS.
Well, exactly. And I've realised this as well, is we often talk as though, well, everyone knows what new atheism is, right? But actually there are lots of people who are simply born after it kind of happens.
Yeah.
And it's more of a historical artifact.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I definitely wasn't aware of it at its height. So could you just, for anyone like that, could you just briefly explain what you mean by new
Graham and I are
atheism?
definitely old enough to remember it when it was
certainly
happening.
Yeah.
It was essentially something that really exploded into public consciousness, I think, in the mid-2000s, partly in response to 9/11. And it involved certain well-known intellectual figures, people like Richard Dawkins, the Oxford biologist, Sam Harris, who was a sort of neuroscientist and public intellectual, Daniel Dennett, a well-known philosopher, Christopher Hitchens, who's obviously passed away since. But these were the so-called four horsemen of the new atheism, was what they were called. And they each had their own sort of best-selling book against God, against religion. Obviously, the best known of the bunch, Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion. Sure. And this really, for whatever reason, just happened to land at the right time to catalyze a sort of very anti-religious form of atheism, very public, not afraid to sort of be involved in media. The internet was blossoming at the time. And so I think it allowed lots of like-minded people to come together in a new way and feel like they were able to band together. And there was also just, especially in the USA, I think, a certain kind of fear around religious fundamentalism and that kind of thing. There were debates around intelligent design and creationism in schools. Some people didn't like the fact George W. Bush was an evangelical Christian and so on. So I think all of this coalesced into this sort of movement called the New Atheism that was responding and pushing against religion and basically saying, we need to, the sooner we're rid of it, the better. It's not only false, it's dangerous. And that was kind of the, at the center of it. And it was a big phenomenon for a while. They even had, I'm sure you remember the atheist bus campaign here in the UK, where we had London buses just probably down on the street there, rolling by emblazoned with the word says, probably no God, now stop worrying and enjoy your life. So that's probably the closest that atheism has ever come to a sort of advertising campaign in the UK.
Sure. Yeah. It's ironically quite evangelical of them, isn't it?
Well, yeah. I mean, that was the ironic thing, is if they were hoping to sort of get people to stop thinking about God, it was the perfect way to make them start thinking about God.
Great point.
And it was interesting that, because I've been thinking about what made it new, because atheism has been around for many, many years.
Yes.
And one could debate where it began and so on. But and before that, and I can remember, writing a book back in the early 2000s, where the main kind of context was kind of postmodernism. It was basically the idea that there are many different versions of many different stories, of which Christian faith is one that has been privileged, but now we put it to one side because we have to listen to all these different voices, and relativization of truth, that truth doesn't really kind of have any purchase any longer. That was the primary kind of context in which Christian faith or any religious faith was being expressed. And I can remember revising the same book for another edition 10 years later, after 9/11, after the new atheism, and suddenly realized actually the context is now very different. Not only do you have this sort of postmodern relativism, you also have this very dogmatic kind of rationalist, there is a truth.
Yeah.
There is one real truth. And the truth is that there is no God.
Yes.
Which had come from
and I think that was
Dawkins.
probably a little bit was the change in the tone, was that there was a truth claim at the center of it. And there was this real concern that actually religion was really bad for us, and therefore we needed to know the truth, and the truth will set you free.
Yeah.
There was this almost evangelistic edge as well to it. Dawkins stated quite clearly actually at the start of his book that he hopes this will stop people from being religious anymore. So it was a kind of almost quasi-religious evangelistic fervor to this movement. And I think that's probably what was so new about it. It was just the fervor, the dogmatism that seemed to mark it.
It was a kind of renewal of the rationalist project of the Enlightenment, perhaps in a way that had faltered a little bit in the postmodern years. And but I suppose, having bearing all that in mind, I mean, I guess your book is about, well, the subtitle is why New Atheism grew old and secular thinkers are considering Christianity again. In some ways, you're describing the kind of rise and fall of the new atheism. We've talked a bit about the rise, why it happened, post 9/11, fears about kind of the damaging results of religion in society. Why do you think it began to fade, and why do you think it is no longer the power that it was then?
I mean, it's worth saying you will still find new atheist type thinking in lots of corners of the internet. So it's not like it's disappeared off the scene by any stretch, but it just isn't the cultural force it once was. The leaders of it aren't being invited to write op-ed pieces on that subject, at least for newspapers. And in fact, what you'll notice is that all the leaders of, those four horsemen, well, obviously one of them passed away, Christopher Hitchens, but the other three, they're not out there critiquing religion anymore, interestingly. They've all moved on to other things. And the movement itself is largely a shadow of its former self. And I think there were a number of reasons for that. I think generally, the public got a bit bored of a slightly shrill, dogmatic kind of approach to these issues. And it sort of, started to ignore it a bit more. I think among the public, there was just more of a sense that actually life is more complex than this. And there was a real sense, I think, that you couldn't really build a positive ethic for life from simply science and reason. I think people started to realize that this toolkit wasn't enough to give you, it's all very well to say God is dead and so on, but what do you put in place of God? And I think the new atheism kind of failed to deliver on that. And then thirdly, I think it's the movement itself kind of was riddled eventually with all kinds of internal problems that led to its kind of internal downfall. So I talk in the book about one particular moment, which I think was sort of a hinge moment for them. There was an atheist conference in Dublin in 2011, and they had a female skeptical blogger called Rebecca Watson, who goes online as Skeptic, talking about the fact that she felt the atheist movement was dominated by male white men, the fact that there was a lot of misogyny and sexism that she was encountering. Anyway, she then has late night drinks with the other conference speakers, goes back to her room about 4 a.m. in the morning. And basically one of the people at the conference propositions her in the elevator on the way up. And she sort of talked about this afterwards on her vlog and said, this is the problem, this is exactly what I was pointing out. That might have been the end of it, except that Richard Dawkins then responded extremely sarcastically with a sort of blog post titled Dear Muslima, in which he kind of compared the terrible things that your American sisters are going through, being asked for coffee in an elevator compared to, the trivial things you're having to face of having your hands chopped off for your, non-religion and that kind of thing. And anyway, he just sort of poured petrol on what was already a highly combustible situation. And this, I really see as the point where the movement started to fracture into those who wanted to go in a more kind of socially conscious direction, where they affirmed certain things like feminism and LGBT rights, and felt it wasn't enough just to be atheism. We have to be what they called atheism plus other things. And others like Dawkins and many others who kind of went in what eventually became the kind of quote unquote anti-woke direction. They felt this was a political ideology sort of overtaking their free thought movement. So in a sense, I think what killed new atheism in the end was the culture wars, basically, because it split the movement down the center. And they got to the point where some of these architects of the movement wouldn't share a stage with each other. They were so sort of angry and had fallen out with each other so badly. So it was an interesting thing to watch from the sidelines, that whole thing as it started to unravel.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. The only atheist book I've ever read is actually David Baddiel's very recent one called The God Desire. And interestingly, he's as critiquing of new atheism, he's almost as critiquing of new atheism as he is of religion and Christianity. And his argument is that he desires God so much that it alerts him to the fact that it therefore must be fantasy. So it's a very different argument, a very different atheist argument. And that's where he critiques new atheism. He says they all just pretended they didn't want or need God.
Right.
And it just didn't work, and that's why it fell. So what would you say to his slightly nuanced, slightly different atheist argument?
I mean, it's an interesting way of looking at it. And I think he's right in the sense that I think the new atheism dismissed that sort of instinct that is there, actually, that kind of religious instinct, really, and the God-shaped hole. I think that probably David Baddiel is kind of essentially identifying there, that exists in most people. Now, obviously, he takes that to be something that probably therefore is a fantasy, a projection or something, because we kind of want it to be true. But I don't know, I would just interpret that very differently to David Baddiel, in as much as I love the way C.S. Lewis puts it, when he says, a child experiences hunger while there is such a thing as food. A duckling wants to swim while there is such a thing as water. People feel sexual desire while there is such a thing as sex. And then he says, if I experience in myself a desire which nothing in this world can satisfy, the only conclusion is that I was made for another world. So the question is, well, if we do have this innate, deep desire for there to be something like God, and we see it across all times and places and cultures being expressed, then maybe there is something that meets it. Maybe that's actually evidence that there is something that meets it, rather than some evidence that it's just a sort of a fantasy that we've invented. I would see it almost like the opposite way to the way he conceives it.
And what do you make of, I guess one theme that kind of emerged in maybe the second iteration of the new atheism was a kind of acknowledgement that, well, maybe religion have got a few good things, right? They're quite good at building community, for example. And therefore, atheists need to learn how to do that. And you had the rise of the atheist church, which for a time became quite popular and was sort of spreading around the world. But I guess as Christians know, planting a church is a fairly easy thing. Sustaining it is a longer term thing. What do you make of those kind of atheist attempts to kind of create community and to try and mirror religion in that kind of way? And what happened to that? Did you have any conversations with people about the whole atheist church phenomenon and so on?
Yeah, I did. I had a number of conversations. So there was something called the Sunday Assembly, which I think is still going. And that was essentially founded by two stand-up comedians, both of whom were not Christians and but wanted something like church. They recognized the value that held. And we did a couple of shows, and conversations engaging with that. And Sanderson Jones, one of those people, came on to talk about it. And I had a lot of respect for what they were trying to do, because in a sense they were trying to take a different tack to the new atheists. Actually, they explicitly didn't make it about we hate God and you should stop believing in God in the sort of services they held. It was far more about a kind of a positive ethic for like, well, how are we going to live together in community and they would have a sort of inspiring TED talk type thing instead of a sermon, and they would maybe sing a rousing Queen rendition instead of a hymn. And whatever, and maybe have a sort of
sing
time
John
for
Lennon's Imagine over and over again.
Exactly. A meditation instead of prayer or whatever. But I think ironically, I think even that kind of, as far as I heard, it's kind of experienced its own set of sort of splits as they tried to put the franchise out worldwide. People had different ideas. So it suffered from all the same problems that religion actually ends up suffering from, in terms of denominations that split apart and so on. And I guess I wondered, in the end, how long it could be sustained. I think there was a bit of a sort of a buzz around it to start with. But for me, the big difference between like an atheist church and a Christian church is that you're not just gathering around a kind of a set of shared ideals, because you can do that at the golf club. It's a person. It's something bigger than you that hopefully manages to do something miraculous in the process of bringing people who are very different together.
Yeah. I'm reminded of, I think it was St. Augustine described the church, or at least described the church in this way, we gather around the object of our love. And that's why the Christian church over the centuries has been, despite all its tendency to divide and argue, and, we do that as much as anyone, but, there is at the heart of the Christian faith an object of love, which is this God who is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, which somehow people gather around because he is, God is an object of love, and it draws people. And that's why it's been so successful at building community. And that's maybe why atheism wasn't quite able to do that, because there's no object of love at the heart of it. As you say, it's a rather abstract set of ideals,
if there's
rather
anything,
than
it's
something which draws people together.
In the humanist philosophy, the human, me, is at the center of it. And I think that's always difficult. I think, in a sense, to the degree that it, channeling my inner Tom Holland here, to the degree that it was successful, it was because it aped essentially Christian virtues and practices. And that's the problem so often, even in the new atheism, was that they were effectively arguing for Christian concepts that were, I think, very much birthed of the Christian Revolution, but without the story that actually birthed
without the pearl of great price that is at the heart of it, which made sense of it all. Yeah.
But you have a feeling that this particular moment in time is quite an interesting one, in that there seems to be somewhat of a turning of the tide, which is beautifully demonstrated on the front of your book.
Yes, a sort of incoming wave on the front of the book.
An incoming wave, exactly. So can you talk us through that premise? What is the incoming wave?
So the central metaphor of the book is this idea of the sea of faith, and it comes from quite a well-known poem by Matthew Arnold, I think written in 1867, called Dover Beach. And there's this famous stanza in it. In fact, I use it in the introduction of the book, that says, "The sea of faith was once to at the full and round earth's shore lay like the folds of a bright girdle furled, but now I only hear its melancholy, long withdrawing roar." And that long withdrawing roar of the sea of faith has, in a way, stood as a place marker for the retreat of religion, over the last 150 years or more since he wrote those words. And that's often been used as an analogy for the way in which secularism is simply, sweeping through the West and everything else. But then I had this conversation with Douglas Murray a few years ago. Douglas Murray, as probably many people will know, is a sort of political commentator, certainly sort of more on the right than the left. But he's interesting in as much as he describes himself as a Christian atheist, like many guests who have been on the show, actually, someone who doesn't necessarily believe but can see the value of Christianity in the way it shaped the West, doesn't really believe atheism amounted to giving people meaning or purpose, that religion, and Christianity in particular, has done a much better job of that. And he remarked that he was seeing some of his secular intellectual peers actually converting to Christianity as well. And he said maybe this is a moment when the church has more of an opportunity to speak into a more receptive crowd, because the thing about the sea of faith is that it could come back in again. That's the point of tides. And it was almost blindingly obvious when I thought about it, but I hadn't really thought, but Matthew Arnold's sea of faith could come in again. We could maybe even be seeing that turning of the tide in our generation, because I'd noticed similar things, the sort of, as we said, new atheism sort of growing old, and the fact that increasingly I was seeing interesting secular intellectuals taking Christianity seriously again, not necessarily believing themselves, but certainly giving it the time of day, not dismissing it, and even opening the door to it, perhaps for other people. And like Douglas Murray, seeing some interesting examples of people who had actually converted, surprisingly. So that was kind of at the center of the book, was this idea that maybe we're seeing that turning of the tide in that way.
And that Matthew Arnold's problem was that he didn't stay long enough on the beach.
Yes, if he maybe waited a few hours, the tide might have started coming back in.
The whole metaphor would have been very different. And I guess the other thing that's always struck me about that poem is the line, I think again you quoted it, the sea of faith lay like, was once too at the full and round earth's shore, lay like the folds of a bright girdle furled. In other words, he assumes this is a global phenomenon, this retreat of faith.
Yes.
But of course we know that's far from true, that actually it's really only in Europe and North America that we are seeing religion sort of retreating. And in most parts of the world, actually it's remains, in fact, becoming more and more of a powerful force.
I think we sometimes do have a bit of an insular view of this, because even though in the West, obviously, we constantly hear the statistics about church decline and the rise of the nuns, if you actually look at the global statistics, atheism is declining as a proportion of the global population. And just at one level, just because religious people have more children, and our secularized Western countries are having less children. And so it's interesting, as you say, this is a very specifically Western phenomenon in that sense.
When you say you're seeing a resurgence in people being open to Christianity, attracted to it even, do you think that it's just quote unquote Christian values? I saw a piece in the Times recently, I forget who wrote it, so huge apologies, but said, we've banished Christianity Christian morals. Now where are we? You know, and I think Louise Perry says a similar thing. She said it on our podcast in season 1. She said she was very nervous about where we are without Christian morals. So is it that you see people wanting? It's like it's slipping away and people are getting nervous and wanting to pull that tide back in? Or is that being unfair? Is it more of the mystical and the enchanting and the unexplainable that people are kind of more open to?
I think there's a real spectrum of different places where people find themselves. And I think at one end, you probably have got people who are just willing to kind of accept that Christianity might not have been so bad because it might have helped to shape society in certain ways and so on. In fact, you know, interestingly, a number of the new atheists even have changed their tune remarkably around that. Richard Dawkins isn't nearly as disparaging of Christianity as I think he would have been 10 or 15 years ago, partly just because he sees that the culture and some of the battles he's now facing, you know, with some of the things he's saying, he's realizing, oh, maybe Christianity wasn't so bad. But then you've got sort of interesting sort of, I mean, obvious examples are people like Jordan Peterson and others who are kind of asking, as secular sort of thinkers, well, can we live without something like the Christian story to make sense of life? But still seem to be approaching it as a kind of useful psychological thing, you know, potentially for people to have in their lives, or yes, it gave a great framework for, you know, human rights and that sort of thing. So there's a kind of a utility approach almost, and kind of, you know, as they sort of seem very pro Christianity, but don't quite seem to be ready to say it's all, you know, I'm all in and so on. And then you have got some people though who are, I think, quite drawn to the Christian faith in and of itself and find it very attractive just as an appealing aesthetic option. I mean, I'm thinking back to when we had Tom Holland here, and lots of people have remarked at the very end of that interview when he spoke quite candidly about his own sort of sense of longing almost that Christianity might be true. I think there are people who are in that category as well, who both see its value and feel like, wouldn't the world be an amazing place if it was true?
And you've had people, I suppose, I mean, you talked about Douglas Murray and Jordan Peterson, maybe Tom Holland and others who are drawn to the ethic or the aesthetics or the appeal of Christian faith. I guess you've had others like Paul Kingsnorth and Tom who have
made the step,
come to a very fully orbed Christian faith. And I guess I'm wondering what in your experience, in your conversations, leads to someone making that extra step into Christian faith. What is it that holds people back at the moment from that step, you know, drawing almost to the kind of verges of Christian faith, but reluctant to kind of step into, I'm all in.
It's I wouldn't want to speak for any individual because I'm sure they've all got different reasons for why they haven't necessarily taken that step. I don't think I'm telling tales out of school to say that when I had this conversation with Douglas Murray, I did ask him essentially this question, well, what's stopping you, Douglas? And he said, well, look, he just basically has some critical questions around the Bible, really, and whether we can really take it seriously as a historical document, especially regarding Jesus. Now, maybe, you know, I was having a conversation, funny enough, between him and N.T. Wright. Maybe they need to have a separate conversation, you know, about those issues. I don't know whether that would be enough for Douglas Murray. He said at the time, actually, no, this was in a separate conversation. He said, I'd need to hear a voice. And I found that an interesting way of putting it, because I think for some people, they really do want something that feels out of this world.
Back to the kind of experience.
There is a kind of like, I really need an experience of some kind. And I get the sense that Paul Kingsnorth, who you mentioned, you know, when we spoke to him on this show, he I think certainly had been on an intellectual journey, but he's also talked about the fact that it was really a set of experiences as well that took him to that. So it's hard to avoid that. For me, the big question inevitably is that to the degree that you will have an spiritual experience is to some extent down to how open you are to the idea of a spiritual experience. And I think there are just a lot of guards up against that in our culture, because people have been told time and again, for obvious reasons, that you could be fooling yourself. You know, you religion has been taking you in for so long. Don't just trust, you know, this funny feeling you get when you walk into a church and so on.
And it's not a new thing, isn't it? I often think of sort of someone like Iris Murdoch, who was very drawn to the idea of the good as a sort of transcendent reality out there, but could never quite get beyond that to God as a personal being. So, you know, it isn't a new phenomenon of And as you know, I guess that's maybe always been the case, that people are drawn to the benefits of Christian faith, but can't quite make that final
I
step.
think a lot of people come with all the baggage that they probably have from childhood sort of ideas of it or negative associations that come with it. And there's all sorts of things I imagine that probably need to be worked through, and some before people potentially are kind of open enough to do that. I suppose for me, the exciting thing is in a way is that I do feel like, at least at the cultural level, we're starting to see a kind of less of a kind of ridiculing and dismissive attitude towards Christianity as a whole. And it's almost like the door is being opened to people at least being able to look at it for the first time and ask serious questions of it.
Yeah.
In a way that I just didn't sense you could when the new atheism was sort of ruling.
Yeah, because I was going to ask it. I mean, in some ways, your thesis is a rather counterintuitive one, in that all the statistics still seem to suggest that decline is happening. Recent Times survey of clergy in the Church of England suggesting the majority feel we're no longer a Christian country. There doesn't seem yet to be a kind of upturn in religious practice or any of the indicators of religious faith, and yet you are quite hopefully suggesting that there is the tide is turning. I mean, how do you respond to someone saying, "Well, come on, you're being a bit too optimistic here. All the statistics are still downwards."
I'm an inherent optimist, so I probably am being optimistic. But actually, I suppose all I'm really saying, and a lot of people, when I put the title of the book on social media, a lot of skeptics came back with exactly that point. Oh, come on, come off it. There's, look at the statistics. There is no surprising rebirth of belief in God. But really what I'm looking at is the fact that I'm seeing something change in the atmosphere. So this is not about, yes, that of course our pews are continuing to empty. But the question is, could we be seeing the interesting first fruits of something that could signal that there's a change on the horizon? Hence why I think if the tide is turning, it's only just beginning to turn, or we might be sort of just beginning to get to the point where it could turn. And that for me is an optimistic thesis in that sense, because it could go in different directions. There's no guarantee that the Christian worldview is the one that will ultimately come rushing back in. But
yeah, straws in the wind. And I guess the point of that image is that occasionally you might suddenly see straws in the wind, and that's a sign of the weather turning.
Yes.
From one season to another, and it could be that.
We'll see.
Yeah.
We'll see.
Call me a natural rebel. I like the thought that Christianity is about to become the underdog again, because historically it thrives as the underdog.
True.
So it could be that actually this tension is no coincidence,
I agree. And I think my concern would be that whatever it looks like in the future, I don't think it's just going to be the same as it always was. It's just going to kind of go back to some golden era of the Victorian sort of revival or something like that. Because for me, when I look back historically, there's been lots of occasions when I see the church seeming to go into the doldrums and things going off the rails and whatever. But as a Christian, when I look at that history, I do see somehow that God and the Spirit move, and something gets blown into life and unexpected things happen. You get a Wesley rising up from the Anglican Church and suddenly a new movement developing. You get, the various revivals that we've seen. And I just wonder whether if you do believe that the church is not done for, that maybe this could be the start of the next thing, whatever that is. But it probably won't leave the church looking the same as it is now. And that may not be a bad thing. And to that extent, I'm not a good prophet of these things, but I just think that the church has a task on its hands now to kind of ask, well, are we ready? If there was some kind of incoming tide, would we be ready to actually receive it in our doors? Yeah,
and the result of that would not be a return to Christendom as we've known it in the past. Maybe something very different that we can't quite imagine yet. A kind of renewed Christian faith or presence within society probably would look very different now than it had been 100 or 200 years ago.
Exactly. You can't put genies back in bottles to some extent. And there's a sense in which I think we're constantly finding out what that might look like. All I know is that, as G.K. Chesterton put it, Christendom has died, I think he said 1,000 deaths, but it's also experienced a rebirth every time because it has a God who knew his way out of the grave. And for me, that's the optimism that I hold. It's not necessarily that the church is great at doing these things, or that, we're in the secular thinkers who are maybe thinking about Christianity, and it is that I do believe there's a God behind the big sweep of history, and that whatever that looks like, whether it's my optimistic thesis or something else, that God who knows his way out the grave will make that happen again.
So if I posed to you our signature question, can this world be re-enchanted by the mystery and wonder of the Christian story, you would say?
I would say absolutely it can. And in so many ways, I see it being re-enchanted increasingly, as I've looked at lots of different areas of history, culture, science, the Bible. I kind of cover all these areas in the book. I just see telltale signs that people are kind of moving against that materialist, secular story of reality. And it is a story. It's not something you can prove. It just is an assumption that has become the background hum and story of our age.
A set of beliefs, ironically, I suppose.
And I do think people are ready to hear a different story. And I see interesting telltale signs in lots of areas that we haven't covered in this conversation, where various people are pushing back and coming to quite interestingly Christian adjacent, Christian friendly conclusions. And in the end, I just think there's a story that's kind of bubbling away below the surface very often, that we may be surprised at when and where it could come back up to the surface and surprise us with its power again.
Well, just to say, well done, and thank you for the book, Justin. I thought it was really well written, and some fascinating stories in there, lots of different episodes that I think it makes a really interesting case. Whether people go with it or not is up to them. But I would, anyone listening or watching this, I would really recommend them getting hold of the book and reading it. I think it's a really interesting kind of argument, and it's just a good read. So well done.
I'm glad you've said that, because I think you officially have recommended reading it.
Yep.
Yes,
I see on page 2.
You very kindly endorsed it. It's a long time ago
Good
now,
job.
Craig.
I've already said that.
But you stand by that.
Exactly, I do stand by it.
So, Justin, for this is available now, I do believe. So please do buy this book. But also, where else can people go if they want to know more about what you're up to at the moment and engage in more of these sorts of topics?
Well, a good place to go to find out more about it is my website, justinbrierley.com, where you can order the book. You can even get a signed copy. But I'm excited because I've been working on a podcast documentary series that will sort of complement the release of the book this autumn. And so if you're into your podcasts, do go and check that out. It's also called The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. And it really kind of takes those stories and chapters and interviews and just sort of does a long form version of them. So again, if you join the newsletter, you'll get all of the details on that, justinbrierley.com.
So how has it been in the hot seat?
Weird, really weird. I keep feeling like I'm on the wrong side of the table here, but it's been also great fun. So
it's a good experience to know what it's like.
Yes.
Next time you're here,
I will
understand a bit better.
I'll be empathetic to how our guests feel.
Exactly right.
Well, great. Graham, thank you so much for being my co-host for the day. How has that been?
It's been a lot of fun. Yeah, it's very interesting being on this side of it. So, Justin, you may have, maybe you've learned something by being on that side. I've certainly learned something by being on this side. So thank you, Belle.
Oh, my pleasure. It's been a joy. And Justin, thank you so much for this conversation and for the wonderful book.
Thank you so much.